Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. South Korea's Constitutional Court rejected the National Assembly's impeachment of Prime Minister Han Duck-soo today, clearing him of charges related to the controversial martial law plan and judicial appointment delays. The ruling, 5 votes to dismiss, 1 to uphold, and 2 to reject on procedural grounds, comes 3 months after Han was impeached for allegedly aiding President Yoon Suk-yeol's December 3rd martial law declaration. Now, with the decision, Han was immediately reinstated as acting president and returned to government affairs without delay. But the implications may stretch far beyond Han himself. Legal experts and political observers are closely watching how this verdict could shape the Constitutional Court's approach to President Yoon Suk-yeol's impeachment trial. To help us understand the legal and political impact of this ruling, we invite attorney An Jun-sung into the studio. Welcome.
Thank you.
And also joining us online is Lee Hee-yeon, Dean and Professor of Law at Handong International Law School. Great to see you, Professor.
Always a pleasure to be on the program.
So let's start right away with attorney An. So this morning, like I've said, the court dismissed the National Assembly's impeachment motion on Prime Minister Han Duck-soo. Of the 8 justices, 5 voted to dismiss, 1 to uphold, and 2 rejected the motion on procedural grounds. Could you tell us what's your interpretation of today's ruling?
First of all, it was a very weak case from the beginning. It's interesting, setting aside the factual allegation on both sides. It was pretty clear shot for the KCC to make a decision. For example, that the cases had only one hearing, which took 90 minutes. Which, considering the political and legal significance of this impeachment case, is way too short. So I guess from the beginning, I think the cases take it very well. It's very simple case for them to make decision as clear shot. That's why they came up with basically 7-1 decision today. And in respect of his impeachment trial, there was 5 issues, and then 3 issues were related to his role of the prime minister. And 2 issues were related to his role of acting president. So in respect of the first 3 issues, right? Basically, the court is saying that the veto power, only the president has the veto power. Do not share with any other prime minister, basically. So that's the main point of their statement today, and also about the. About the special prosecutor appointment issues, that basically there was a there's expressions like there's without hesitation, means that it's allowing the reasonable delay. So it doesn't actually mean that it's not immediately per se. So unless otherwise it's defined by otherwise in the provision saying that without delay means that reasonable delay is acceptable, and court looked at it as 10-day delay was reasonable under the circumstances, and therefore there was no violation of the law or constitutional law. And lastly, they talk about the KCC appointment of the justice appointment issue. He rejected. There's only one ground that court that agree with the National Assembly argument, saying that it's the violation of constitutional law. However, it was not serious enough to impeach him from the post. I think that's the ruling today.
Right. Thank you for summarizing the whole grasp of today's ruling for us. Now to Professor Lee. So one of the issues at the time of the impeachment motion against Prime Minister Han was whether the National Assembly has met the required quorum as well. Han's side argued that since he was serving as acting president, the quorum for impeaching a president, not a cabinet member, should have been applied. But 6 justices concluded that there were no procedural issues. Could you explain for us the reasoning behind this?
Right. As you noted, with respect to the issue of what was necessary for the impeachment to actually go forward was basically found in the Constitution. This is Article 65. And Article 65 of the Constitution provides that in cases of impeachment for the president, you need at least 200 members to vote in favor, which would then pass the resolution. But for the other officials, so the prime minister as well as other cabinet officials, if you want to impeach those officials, you need 151. So you need a simple majority of the National Assembly members to vote in favor. So the real question here was, did you consider, or does the impeachment motion needs to consider the prime minister's role as acting president? So therefore, should that 200 threshold be met for the impeachment, or do you consider him still to be the prime minister even though he's acting president? And so that was really the crux of the issue as to whether or not you would treat him as president essentially, and therefore you would have to meet that 200 vote threshold. But as the court noted, basically, the 6 justices that basically indicated that procedural threshold was met because, in terms of his role as acting president, he still is the prime minister, despite his fact that he was appointed, given the circumstances under the Constitution, to be the acting president. So what the court decided in this case was not to look to his role as acting president, but to his original position as prime minister. And so I think what the court is doing here is preserving the integrity of his appointment as prime minister, and that is the way he should be treated. Although there were 2 justices that voted against this and said basically, we have to sort of look at this in terms of his role as acting president, and he should be treated as the president because he has the powers of the presidency in his role as acting president. So there was some dispute, and naturally, depending on your, which side of the political aisle you stood on, obviously the ruling party would say, the president, of course, and acting president should be treated the same, and therefore should meet the same requirements as President Yoon with respect to his impeachment. But the Constitutional Court disagreed. And so essentially what you're having here is keeping the role of the prime minister and assessing that his status as prime minister should be controlling in this case. And that's essentially what the Constitutional Court did.
Right, so the court seemed to have drawn a clear line on that. Now, another thing to note during today's trial is the National Assembly's argument that Han should be removed from office for allegedly conspiring or giving consent to Yoon to declare martial law. But yet, not only the 5 justices who voted for dismiss, but also the one who supported the impeachment, Justice Chung Kye-sun, concluded that there was no violation of the Constitution. Could you tell us the reasoning behind this?
Well, this is a very simple case, actually, from the legal perspective, because this is about the allegedly, the prime minister was conspiring with the president on the martial law declaration. But look at it here. By definition, conspiracy is basically an agreement between 2 or more persons to commit a crime. And where is the agreement, right? The first element, the prime element is the agreement between the party. Here, the Prime Minister Han Duck-soo and President Yoon. And from the beginning, I think the Prime Minister was making arguments saying that he didn't know until the last minute. And then later he found out the fact that he tried to declare the martial law. He said he did his best to prevent him, persuaded not to do it, but he couldn't stop it. And from the legal court perspective, should they do something against any the officials who couldn't persuade someone from doing something illegal? And he shouldn't use some physical power, anything, any exercise and power, anything, right? So basically, I think the court looking at from perspective that he did it best under the circumstances, and he didn't really violate any law. I think that's very important. And means also from their perspective, the court found that basically means that there was insufficient evidence to prove that there was the agreement between the Prime Minister Han Duck-soo and the President Yoon and to declare the martial law from the beginning. So I guess that's more important. And however, from the other side, President Yoon's perspective is not really good. It's not bright future for him as well, because that conspiring with Prime Minister is not necessarily means that conspiring with someone else. So he could still have some problem with someone else in conspiracy charges and likewise. So the court didn't really find there's a sufficient evidence to prove there's agreement or causation between the 2-party prime minister and president, but does not necessarily mean that there was no connection with someone else.
So we'll have to get closely watch on that front as well. But regarding President Yoon's martial law declaration, the court did not make any legal or constitutional judgment on a December 3rd martial law proposal itself, and which is an issue that could influence, the impeachment case against President Yoon. Professor Lee, how should we interpret the court's silence on this point?
Well, I think everyone who's watching this decision for Prime Minister was trying to get some indication as to how the court would then decide President Yoon's fate. And as Attorney An pointed out, this was a relatively straightforward case. The fact that the Constitutional Court didn't spend a lot of time on Prime Minister Han's sort of impeachment case, I think, is telling, because the National Assembly that brought this case really didn't have much to sort of ground its impeachment on the prime minister. And so, the essential question here with respect to the prime minister, as Attorney An pointed out, was basically, did he somehow aid the president in declaring martial law? And so, the constitutionality of martial law itself really was not at issue when it comes to Prime Minister Han's case. And so basically, the Constitutional Court didn't need to address that question in deciding the issue. Now, some people, of course, are surmising that, because there's a lack of consensus among the justices with respect to President Yoon, that basically that's not the reason why, the legality or illegality of martial law itself was not addressed. But, essentially, again, it was not relevant to the question that was posed to the court as to the grounds for impeachment for the prime minister. And so, again, the essential question there was, did he have any role in the declaration of martial law? And basically, it was a question of whether or not you believe the prime minister, as well as the other evidence that was presented, that he, had some role in the approval of the martial law declaration. So, at the end, basically, the court didn't have to address the question itself. And, naturally, the court is not going to involve itself in an issue that necessarily doesn't have to decide. But I think a lot of people were maybe disappointed in maybe trying to get some hint as to what the court would decide eventually with respect to President Yoon. So I think that's really what the court did, because it was really not an issue with respect to whether or not the martial law itself was unconstitutional or not, because it was not an issue.
Right, and we still have to wait for that ruling in the coming days. Now, despite the situation, though, many people still believe that today's ruling could still influence President Yoon's impeachment trial, though they're, legally separate cases, but they're both on impeachment. Attorney An, do you think today's ruling might offer some positive clues about the outcome of Yoon's impeachment trial?
Well, actually, as Professor Lee pointed out correctly, it's really this case, the Prime Minister's case, was not really talking about the illegality of the martial law declaration itself. So the court really didn't talk about anything. So we still have open shot on that really major issue on whether that's legal or illegal to declare martial law at the time under the circumstances on December 3rd. This is really critical question we ask, and then the approval can check actual complaint made by the National Assembly on the impeachment trial. And basically, it's mainly focused on the declaration of martial law procedurally and substantively, whether it's consistent with the Korean constitutional law. So I think that one of the things the court were looking at, maybe they're looking at focus on procedural matter, which the court did not talk about today, because that didn't talk about the illegality of the martial law declaration, because it was not really relevant to the case, this Prime Minister impeachment case at the point. So, however, I think that the court will focus on procedural things first, because that if you really talk. There's a process here, logical timeline. So if there's some problem, flaw on the procedural matter, they don't even have to talk about it. So basically, I think the best idea they come up with, if they can agree, if the 8 justices come to agree on the procedural issues, that there was insufficiency or there was some illegality on the or insufficiency of the procedure problem, they don't have to even discuss the other further issues. So I think that's a very clever idea, but I don't know whether they can actually achieve that idea. But if they cannot agree on that procedural issue, if we go with the substantive law issue, it might be very complicated to get consensus among the 8 justices.
Right, so we'll have to wait and see until that. So with this dismissal of this motion, Prime Minister Han returned to his post today as acting president after 87 days rather, and the opposition is now expected to ramp up pressure to appoint Ma Eun-hyuk, especially since the court previously ruled that the refusal to appoint Ma was unconstitutional. Professor Lee, do you think Ma would be appointed, and could this become a late-stage variable in Yoon's impeachment trial?
I don't think there's any rush for the prime minister to actually appoint Judge Ma to be on the court, even though the National Assembly at the time, submitted his name for nomination for appointment by, then acting President Cheng Sang-mok. But, in this case, this case had actually appeared before the Constitutional Court, before in terms of whether or not, at then acting President Che had a duty to appoint, Judge Ma to be on the court. But if we recall, the decision of the Constitutional Court at the time was that basically that there was a duty for the acting president to make the appointment, given that fact that the National Assembly forwarded his name for appointment by the president. But that the Constitutional Court itself decided that it could not compel the acting president to actually go forward with the appointment, because the difficulty here for the court was it could certainly declare the constitutionality or unconstitutionality of the issue of the appointment, but couldn't itself order the appointment of the justice to its own bench. And so, the court itself is very limited in that regard because it doesn't have the authority to appoint. So the court found itself in a very difficult position, because while it said that the acting president had the duty to appoint, it itself could not make that decision and appoint, because that's beyond the scope of its power. So the prime minister, if that's the precedent, then this is a question, really is a political question, because the court has already ruled about its constitutionality, that there should be an appointment. But again, if the prime minister decides not to appoint, the question then becomes a political question. So I don't think at this point there's any rush on the prime minister's part to go about with the appointment, particularly obviously now we have the impending impeachment decision by the court with President Yoon. But even if Judge Ma was appointed, Judge Ma would not take part in any decision making with respect to the actual impeachment. But I think the time is ticking, of course, because we all know that there are two justices on the court that are going to retire. And so I think that is certainly on everyone's mind, is that this has to be done before April. And then if Justice Ma is going to be appointed, that's going to, obviously another variable added to this question about the judgment itself. So, but I don't, again, in conclusion, there's no rush for the prime minister to make that appointment.
Now, this latest ruling on Prime Minister Han marks Constitutional Court's first judicial decision involving a senior official over the martial law. Initially, the court said President Yoon's case would take precedence over others, but Han's case came first. How do you read behind this?
It's a very interesting question, because the KCC didn't say we're going to do it first. President first came first, but they basically means that they prioritize the process, so they make it faster. Doesn't necessarily means that we'll do the first, President first. And one other thing, I think it really depends on which side you are. And if you try to looking at the bright side, bright future, if you are with the president side, we're looking at that since we have a nine dismissal case of the impeachment cases. That's a great victory case, and they're hoping for better future. So 10 dismissal straight. And if you're the other side, we're looking at that's the really perhaps the KCC taking political decisions, saying that before getting dismissal case, actually get try to avoid any political instability. Perhaps by political vacuum, because the president was removed. If he removed, maybe the prime minister have to keep in position already and prepare for the political vacuum. So I guess that might be, depends on your side. If you try looking at bright side, there's a very, very interesting story that can come of it. Right.
Now, there are a lot of speculations about President Yoon Suk-yeol's final ruling on when it would actually happen. Professor Lee, some predict that it could come by the end of this week. Some say it would go by next week. Why do you think it's taking too long? And when do you expect the ruling to be announced?
Well, I think it's certainly possible. I think a lot of people are watching this Friday, right, to be the date which the court will then come out with its ruling on the President Yoon's impeachment. And that's because, you have, again, as I mentioned before, the impending retirements of two justices in April. And so the way the court works typically, and this is with respect to its normal process of decision making, is usually the last, on the 27th, of March, which is this Thursday, it will come out with its regularly monthly rulings on cases, and particularly because there are two justices that are going to retire, this is the last opportunity for the regular cases, not the impeachment cases, but the other court cases before the court, that before justices retire, they will make a final ruling on those kinds of regular constitutional law questions. But because the impeachment is such a high priority, the question is, given, the potential, issues that among the justices themselves about what the decision will be, the 28th seems to be likely. But again, if the court hasn't really ironed out its decision, literally meaning that if the court hasn't really come to consensus, or they're still writing their opinions, because again, the court could dismiss, there could be a vote in favor or against, and then justices will have an opportunity to comment and write their own opinions, either concurring or dissenting opinions based on the actual outcome of the case. And so what I suspect is happening is a lot of discussion is happening among the justices right now as to what the decision will be, and they're trying to iron out maybe the actual outcome in terms of the actual votes. And then depending on whether you're a dissenting judge or part of the majority, then you're going to write your decision. And so it may be that if the decision doesn't come out this week, it's partly because the justices are still really working out the reasoning of their decisions. And if that happens, I think what we're going to see probably is this may go into April, but certainly before the time the two justices have to retire, which is sometime in mid to late April. So I think at the latest, you're going to see early April to mid-April if the fact the decision actually comes out. So I think in the sort of conclusion basic to all of this is, right, people are expecting hopefully the 28th to be the day the court comes out with its decision. But again, there's no precedent for all of these major decisions to come out in 1 week. And so the court may be taking its time, maybe because the complicated nature of this case, or maybe because there really isn't any consensus that the court has achieved at this point. But obviously only time will tell, and we'll see very soon within the next couple of weeks how the court actually decides. And so obviously the whole country will be waiting with bated breath as to what the court actually decides.
Right. So there's growing speculation about a verdict this week, but the lack of a set date still leaves room for further delays up to mid-April. Gentlemen, we will have to conclude our discussion right here, though. Thank you so much for your insights, Attorney An.
Thank you.
And Professor Lee, thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Hey, thanks for having me.
And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Till then, stay informed and engaged.